Hi everyone, I'm weathering a torrential rainstorm out here, so I hope it doesn't interfere too much as I do this next one in my series of album rankings. This is going to be John and Yoko. John Lennon Yoko Ono Double Fantasy, released on November 17th, 1980. And this was a welcome return, comeback of sorts for John Lennon, who hadn't been in the business for 5 years. I was a teenager at the time, a rabid John Lennon fan. And like so many fans, I was hoping that John would sign with a contract and get back to recording. And he ultimately did. He went with Geffen Records, David Geffen's company. And it was so exciting at the time when we heard the news that he was back after all that time away in August of 1980 when he was recording the album. This album was released in November 17th of 1980. And not a moment too soon for those diehards like me. And how this came to be was that John Lennon had been retired for 5 years. He was home making a lot of bread, hanging around the house, letting Yoko Ono take care of most of the business ventures because he didn't really have that talent, as he said. And he was trying to be something more of a father this time to his new son, Sean, who was just about to turn 5 years old. And by the time this album came out, Sean did turn 5. And John would start to get bored at times, so Yoko suggested that he go on some trips, including Bermuda. And during Bermuda, John was having a mid-Atlantic storm one time where it was 20-foot waves and all kinds of harsh seas. And the situation got so bad that at one point, John himself had to take the helm and had to try to steer the ship. He was out there sailing, and he was the man that had to be in charge. And he recounted how he was down on his knees sometimes by the fierce weather, constant smacking him in the face, 20-foot waves, water always all over him. And it kind of made him stronger and kind of got him rejuvenated in a way. And that was one of the several things that inspired him to get back into recording. Well, there was that. Also the fact that just a little earlier than that year, Paul McCartney had been releasing another album, McCartney 2, and one of the tracks from there, Coming Up, the studio version, which John later called the freaky version. He likes the freaky version better than the live version, he said. And he was really impressed by that song by Paul and thought that it was really, for Paul McCartney anyway, kind of a daring thing to do. And that inspired John a little bit too. But probably the icing on the cake was when he went to a club once at night and he heard all kinds of new music, including the B-52s doing Rock Lobster. And when he heard Rock Lobster, he heard them paying tribute and homage of sorts to Yoko Ono, doing her kind of like squealing and cackling and stuff at the end of the song. And he said to himself, they're ready for us now. They finally caught on to what we were trying to do. So he immediately went back and told Yoko, let's get in the studio. Let's record. And they both began writing songs. This was in June or July of 1980. And by August, they were in the studio and everyone was thrilled. So they worked on this together as a kind of joint album. It's about a married couple having a dialogue between one another. The system was going to be that John would have a song, then Yoko would follow up with a song, then John and Yoko and so on, in between tracks like that. Back and forth interaction between the two. By the way, this is the back cover before I get to show it. Standing by the corner, Central Park in the Dakota. I've stood there a number of times myself, I'm happy to say. And Jack Douglas produced the album, and he said that John and Yoko actually worked separately. He said that Yoko would come in at like something like 11 o'clock in the morning and work until 6 or 6:30 p.m. And then John would come in at 7 and take over and do his tracks separately. Apparently they couldn't work too well in the studio together, according to Jack Douglas. Now, I'll take that to be, the truth from as far as Jack Douglas says it. But I find it interesting that there are many photos around with both John and Yoko together in the recording studio. And there's also some footage out there shot on a camcorder, which is considered one of John's last interviews, where somebody has a candid shot of John in the studio. And Yoko is there on the side, lying down taking a nap. She's not home. But, I mean, so I really don't know. I'll take that with a grain of salt. But whatever it is, they kind of worked more or less doing their own tracks their own way at the time. On this album, we had great musicians like Earl Slick, Hugh McCracken, Tony Levin, George Small, and Andy Newmark. Now, the thing about Hugh McCracken is, there's a quote that he often tells. He says, you know, he had worked on Paul McCartney's Ram album. And now I'm going to paraphrase this, but supposedly Hugh said that when John found out about it, he said, well, you know, you realize working on Paul's album was just a warm-up or, you know, rehearsal for my album. Words to that effect, which I think is kind of humorous. So let's see now, before I get into talking about the actual record itself, and I will show, it comes in this pretty standard looking, this one's waterlogged, I have a better one, I don't know what happened here. This pretty standard sleeve, but it has the lyrics on it, thankfully. And the sound quality of this album, I remember even from back in the day, was really fantastic. The production is really good on here, the sound quality on the Geffen label. Very popular label at that time, up and coming. And let's see, other notes I have here prepared. You know, the Double Fantasy album, a lot of people say that, and Fred Seaman is among them. I take everything that Fred Seaman says with a truckload of salt. But Fred Seaman says that, you know, they tried to pull a ruse on everybody, pretend they were this happy Romeo and Juliet couple. But actually, the truth was a lot farther away than that. Well, when you listen to some of the songs on this album, they're not trying to claim that they're the most happy couple. There are songs on this album, which I'll get into as I go along, where they're saying that they have problems and difficulties. You know, it's not that they're always Romeo and Juliet and together. That's the point of it, really. And they're trying to come together and make something out of it. You know, it's sad in retrospect. This album, since it came out in November 17th and John died on December the 8th of 1980, it was like, for those of us who bought it new, and for me, this was the first John Lennon album as a fan that I ever had the opportunity to purchase as a hot new release. It started out as a glorious return to form and happy, optimistic exchanges about the future and where we're going. And then after John was tragically taken from us on December 8th, just about 3 weeks later, it now forever is a bittersweet, melancholy, depressing kind of vibe to it. And that's kind of sad, you know. But only for those of us who remember those first 3 weeks, the only ones who ever got to listen to it with that kind of original intention. So, the charting before I go on. Okay, in the UK, this album reached number 14. And in the US, now a lot of people say, you know, this album didn't do anything till after John died. Well, while it's true that in the US, this album became number 1 after John died, it actually started out at number 25, and it went up to number 12, and then it went up to number 11. So it was climbing from 25 to 12 to 11 at the time John was killed. Whether or not it would have went up on its own, I don't know. But it was rising, just to be official. Okay, so we're going to go through the tracks now. What I'm going to do is take the 14 songs that are on here. I'm going to give them a little rating each from 1 to 10 points. And then at the end, I'm going to average in a total score for this record. Starting with the first single, Just Like Starting Over. I remember when I first heard that single. I was driving in a car with my sister, and the radio announced they were going to play the new John Lennon song, and I pulled right over and I heard it. I remember like it was only yesterday how fantastic it was to hear John's voice again. He was back. He was singing in great form. It was a very uplifting, positive song, but I felt then, and I feel now, that it was a little too like la-di-da and kind of sugary in a way for John Lennon. It was kind of, in a way, while it was great to have him back, it was kind of a disappointment in a way for him to be sounding like Barry Manilow. In fact, when people asked me at the time, well, did you hear the new Lennon song? I didn't hear it. What does it sound like? I said, well, it sounds kind of like that Barry Manilow song, I feel glad when you're glad, feel sad when you're sad. You know, that song. That's how I thought it sounded at the time. Anyway, I still think it's a good song, a decent song. Not great, though. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'll give Just Like Starting Over an 8. It has a very 50s vibe to it. And that's another thing that I should really say. My first impressions back in 1980 of this album were that, you know, gee, John Lennon doesn't sound quite as good as the stuff we'd expect as Yoko does. A lot of critics felt the same way, felt that Yoko's tracks here were much more modern, very much new wave, kind of like maybe a little punk direction, or, you know, just more vital, more like what was current in the music scene. John seemed to want to hark back to the past. Yoko seemed to want to be ahead and do new stuff. And that was not lost on me, even as a teenager at the time. Although I feel now, in retrospect, as an older person, I definitely feel that John's music now has grown on me on this album a lot more. I like John's side of the album a lot more now than I did at the time. Okay, so we're going to go to the second track here, which is Yoko Ono, the B-side of Just Like Starting Over. Kiss, Kiss, Kiss. And everybody was excited. It was kind of like a, I don't know, a weird disco-y, new wavy concoction of Yoko. She sings on it, except for the end where she gets into some moaning and kind of orgasmic feelings. In fact, at the end of the track, it was said that I believe that Yoko went into a room herself in the dark to do the end. So take that for what it's worth. And supposedly John was there to witness this. So this thing about them being not together all the time in the sessions, take that as with a grain of salt. But you know, the thing is, I like the song. It's okay. It's fun. It's quirky. I don't think it's Yoko's best song on the album. And at the end, when she goes into all that crazy orgasmic stuff, it just gets in the way of the song. I only give it a 6 out of 10, but that's not horrible. You know, it's better than average. So I like it enough to give it 6 out of 10. Number 3 is the song "Clean Up Time" on here from John, and it's a song that's got some good guitar on there, and I like the sentiment of it. The idea is that he's going to be getting back into gear and kind of like clean up, whether they mean freshen up their act with drugs and try to like be more wholesome in their bodies and things like that. I like the way that the song goes, and I don't think it's not among his best songs on this album, but it's definitely a good like extra track on there. So good that I give it an 8 out of 10. I enjoy it. Then we got another track from Yoko, number 4, "Give Me Something." Personally, I think while it's a lot of fun, it's probably Yoko's weakest track on here, or one of her weaker tracks. I generally think that, and a lot of people seem to think that, the stuff on Double Fantasy from Yoko is among the best stuff she ever did. But "Give Me Something," well, it starts out really powerfully, and it's a very like forceful, assaulting track, and really will wake you up. Very energetic. I like that about it. The problem I have with it is that it's too short, believe it or not. The fact that it's so short and should have been longer kind of takes something away from me about it. So I give that song also, just like "Kiss, Kiss, Kiss," I kind of give it only a 6 out of 10. Then we go to another John track, and this is a track called "I'm Losing You." And this is where I'm going to say, you know, it's a track with John not being sure what's happening. He can't get through to Yoko on the telephone. He's afraid he's losing her. Their relationship isn't really as great as it could be. He talks about her still like not wanting to drop that cross. She still has hard feelings about when John hurt her then, but hell, that was way back when, he's saying, you know. So they're not exactly, you know, all the time a king and queen here, you know, and passionate love. So I don't know where people get that from. And I should have mentioned, which I forgot to mention, that on the song "Just Like Starting Over," the song is about starting over because he says, "It's been so long since we took the time, you know, let's start over. It'll be just like the early days." You know, so this, again, all this proof on this album that they're not trying to fake that they're this happy, idyllic couple. All right? Now, "I'm Losing You" is really a good rocker from John. He really sings with a lot of conviction. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. He sounds very desperate and emotional in this song, which kind of gives it a strength. I remember when I first heard "I'm Losing You," it was before the album came out, and I turned on the old radio station WNEW FM in New York, and I happened to catch "I'm Losing You" at the end of the track. And I thought, wow, John sounds so good on this track. This is the new album. It's great. But what I loved even better is the song that follows, Yoko's response, which is called "I'm Moving On." Before I talk about "I'm Moving On," let me talk about these two tracks and the instrumentation on them, the performers on them. You know, originally, there was original versions of "I'm Losing You" and "I'm Moving On" that were made. And the Cheap Trick members Rick Nielsen and Bunny Carlos played on the original numbers. Now, a lot of people think that the original track version, which you can hear elsewhere, they're not on the album, they didn't make the album, due to what I think was a management disagreement with their management. but they like the Cheap Trick version better. Me personally, I've heard them. I don't know. I'm unique in that. I prefer the version here with the regular musicians, the way it came out on the album. I like this better. Moving On, in a lot of ways, is my favorite Yoko song on this album, and still to this day, it's just among my favorite tracks of all of this entire album, even more than John's song. There's just something about Yoko coming on with conviction and no nonsense and telling John, save your sweet talk for when you score. I want the truth and nothing more. I'm moving on. You're getting phony. You know, I love that kind of stuff. I love the way she gets on there asserting herself and the tough kind of music that goes along with it. You know, it's really, really good. I give it a 10 out of 10, that particular song. And I remember when I heard this on WNEW-FM, I thought it was such a great segue from John's I'm Losing You into this. I was like, wow, this is going to be a great album. I remember hearing it the first time. That's the next to last track on side one. Side one closes with the beautiful, wonderful, beautiful boy track. It's a tribute to Sean, and it was called Beautiful Boy, parentheses, Darling Boy. And Sean was just turning 5 years old at the time this album was released. And it's sad in a way because originally this song was planned as a hope for the future for John. He has lyrics in there like, I can hardly wait to see you come of age. And, you know, before you cross the street, take my hand. Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. And who knew what was going to happen to John? And now when you hear it, it's very sad because you have a father here looking forward to his boy's growth and maturity, and John didn't live to see it. And there's also a YouTube video out here with Paul McCartney listening to this track, and you can watch Paul chokes up and cannot keep a straight face. He's biting his lip and he's about to break down, I should say. And he's always said that Beautiful Boy may be his favorite John Lennon song, or one of his favorite John Lennon songs. It takes, in a very morbid but, you know, melancholy way, it takes on a whole new meaning and emotion these days. I give it a 10 out of 10. One of John's best ever songs, and one of the best songs on this record. When we flip the record over, we get side two, which starts with Watching the Wheels, which is basically John telling us all what he was doing these 5 years when he was in retirement. People wanted him to get to work, and he wanted to just hang out and do what he wanted to do. He's happy just watching shadows on the wall, and he doesn't need people telling him what to do, you know. But at the same time, he says, I'm just sitting here doing time. So at times, John was not always 100% happy doing that. Watching the Wheels was released as a single, and it's a very strong track, and I like the sound of the whole thing, and I give it a 10 out of 10. Then we go to the second track on side two, which is Yes, I'm Your Angel. It's a Yoko track again. Now, whereas Yoko on this album is pretty much trying to be modern and new wave and current and in vogue with what's going on in the current scene then in 1980, this is the one song where she goes back and sings what sounds like a 1930s type of song. As a matter of fact, Yoko got sued for this because it was said that it was copied from an old classic song called Makin' Whoopee. And I'll leave that for you to decide, but it's a pleasant song. It's really cute. And it's currently being used on TV, a TV commercial with Yoko singing this. So for all those people who think that all Yoko does is scream and croak and wail and whine, not true. She sings a lot, and she sings nicely on this particular song. I give it a 7 out of 10. Yes, I'm Your Angel. Then we get one of the best tracks on the album after that, the song called Woman. When they were recording this album, John referred to it as the Beatle track. He kept saying, let's do the Beatle track again. Let's get to the Beatle track. And it is kind of the most Beatlesque going on here, but what I love about this song is it's a tribute and a love song to his wife, Yoko. But not only is it to Yoko, as John said in his own words, it's to Yoko, but it's also to all women. And this was a maturity for John, a coming of age for John. He always was pretty macho, kind of like a chauvinistic type of young man. But through Yoko and through growing up and maturing, he realized how much women have did for him his whole life, that he didn't even count it. He didn't even think about it earlier in his life. And now he was doing kind of a tribute to women. He even says at the beginning, for the other half of the sky. he calls them. It's really a wonderful turnaround for John, and the song itself is really beautiful. So I give it a 10 out of 10. Yoko's back for track 11. It's a song called Beautiful Boys, plural, not to be confused with Lennon's earlier Beautiful Boy. She sings about her husband John, who she says, now you're 40 years old, and sings of her son Sean, now you're just 4 years old. So he hadn't yet turned 5 at the time this was recorded. But she pays tribute to them. And what I like most about this song is that it's a beautiful sentiment, but the background is very eerie and kind of haunting and creepy in a way. And it kind of has the two come together, with the haunting and the nice together. Has a nice effect. I give Beautiful Boys a 7 out of 10. Then we have the last John Lennon track on this album by himself. It's called Dear Yoko, which might be called a sequel to Oh Yoko from the Imagine album, but it's nowhere near as good. It's okay. I give it a 7 out of 10, Dear Yoko. But the words are kind of like just basic, you know. Even when I watch TV, there's a hole you're supposed to be. But then again, the song Oh Yoko was kind of the same way. I just don't think it's one of his better songs. I give it a 7 out of 10. It's pleasant enough. Then we go for another Yoko track, number 13 on this album. This is Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him, which is one of Yoko's best on here. Really nice poetic lyrics. And I also like the fact that John sings on a backing track here. And some of you may know that in 1984, a few years later, John's backing track was removed from this so they could put out a single, just a new John Lennon single. And I like the John Lennon track of this even better than Yoko Ono's track. I'm glad they did that. Every Man Has a Woman, a really nice Yoko song. I give it 7 out of 10. The last track on the album is kind of a duet in a lot of ways. It's mostly Yoko, but you hear John singing along with it together, and it's a Heartbreakers track to me. It's very powerful. It's called Hard Times Are Over. And the thing about it I love is that, sadly, we know the hard times are not over, because John will die. And when they recorded this, it seemed so nice, and now it's so sad. The irony. Isn't it ironic that rough times are just starting, on the contrary? And I didn't know till I did the research for this particular review that this song was actually done or written in 1973, which kind of put a damper on it for me a little bit. Supposedly about getting off drugs or something, but I like the fact that it's included on this album as the end. And I love the way John and Yoko sing joyfully together as if their arms are on each other and they're toasting, and you have all the people together, it seems, singing along, a big grand finale. And the irony of the tragedy that's about to unfold just makes it all that more, bittersweet. So anyway, I went ahead and I totaled all of the scores together, and then I averaged it by 14. And I got a total of 8.0, an 8. This album gets an 8 out of 10 by the scale. And before I go, I'm going to have a list here that you can see of all the songs listed, ranking my favorite on this album all the way to my least favorite. And I did the best I could with them. It's not always an easy science. So you can watch that. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.